I was 13 years old when this happened. My friends and I used to ride our dirt bikes in the mountains near our neighborhood. We had a usual trail we followed, about 5 or 6 miles in, before we turned around and headed home. It was our routine, something we did after school or on weekends, and we never thought much about it. The trail wasn't particularly difficult, just winding dirt paths cutting through dense trees, scattered rocks, and the occasional fallen log we had to maneuver around. It was fun, freeing, and for the most part safe. One day after school, I wanted to ride, but my friends had other plans. I didn't think much of it. I had ridden the trail alone plenty of times before. I grabbed my gear, started up my bike, and headed into the mountains like usual. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, and the smell of dirt and pine filled the air. The sound of my bike echoed through the trees, the only thing breaking the quiet. I always loved that part, being out there alone, just me and my bike, no distractions. The ride-in was normal. I followed the same route, winding through the trees, kicking up dust behind me. It felt good, and before I knew it, I had reached the turnaround point. I took a moment to stop, catch my breath, and look around. The spot was nothing special, just a small clearing where we usually paused before heading back. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I didn't want to waste too much time since I was alone, so I turned my bike around and started back. That's when I saw it. A tent. It was off to the side of the trail, in a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. Army green, ripped, and torn in places, like it had been sitting there for a long time. Immediately, something felt wrong. I don't know why. There was no reason for me to feel scared. After all, it was just a tent, but every instinct in my body told me to get away from it. The thing that got me was that I hadn't seen it on the way in. I had ridden this trail 100 times, and I would have noticed it before. But it was there now, like it had appeared out of nowhere. The fabric fluttered slightly in the breeze, and for some reason, that tiny movement sent a jolt of fear through me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I hit the throttle and took off, going faster than I ever had before. Trees blurred past me, the bike bounced over rocks and dips in the trail, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept my eyes straight ahead, not daring to look back. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I parked my bike, took off my helmet, and tried to calm down. It was just a tent. That's all. Maybe some hiker had set it up. Maybe some hunter. Maybe it had been there before, and I just never noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had when I saw it. The way the air felt heavier, the way my stomach twisted with unease. The next day, I told my friends about it. They didn't believe me, of course. They laughed it off, said I was imagining things. But I knew what I saw. I convinced them to ride out there with me, just to check. If the tent was still there, then I'd prove I wasn't making it up. If it was gone, well, then I didn't know what to think. We rode out after school, following the same trail. Everything looked normal. The trees, the dirt, the rocks, exactly as they always were. My nerves started to ease a little. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I had imagined it. But when we reached the spot where the tent had been, there was nothing there. Not a single trace. No flattened grass. No ropes or stakes left behind. No footprints. Nothing. It was like it had never been there at all. My friends laughed at me again, said I had probably seen a bush or something and freaked myself out. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, and I knew how it had made me feel. I never rode out there alone again. Even when I was with my friends, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there. Watching. Waiting. The tent was gone, but I knew it had been real. And whoever, or whatever, had set it up had taken it down just as quickly. I still think about it sometimes. About what might have been inside that tent. About why it was there one day and gone the next. And about why, even now, years later, I still get that same uneasy feeling whenever I think about riding alone in the woods. I was driving back from a late meeting in Indiana, Pennsylvania, cutting through the back roads like I always did. It was the kind of rural stretch where you could drive for miles and not see another car, just rolling fields on both sides, a few scattered barns, and old wire fences marking off farmland. The only lights came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of a house far in the distance. The sky was starting to darken, though there was still a faint glow on the horizon. I wasn't in a rush, but I wasn't wasting time either. I just wanted to get home. The road ahead stretched long and empty, disappearing into the distance, the asphalt barely marked, cracked in places, worn from years of weather and disrepair. I could hear the steady hum of my tires against the pavement, the occasional bump of hitting a pothole or uneven patch of road. My mind wandered as I drove, thinking about the meeting, about what I had to do the next day. Just the usual things that take up space in your head on long drives alone. Then, without warning, they appeared. A mass of black birds. Not crows, something else, something slightly smaller, maybe starlings or grackles, but I couldn't be sure. They rose up from the fields like a dark wave, hundreds of them, maybe more. They moved together, a swirling cloud, a single entity made up of countless beating wings. I barely had time to react. I slammed on my brakes, the tires skidding on the worn road, and came to a stop just as the birds passed over me. They were so close I could hear them, the rush of wings, the chaotic rustling, the occasional sharp chirp cutting through the air. They weren't just flying overhead, they were circling, doubling back, their movement wild and unpredictable. My breath caught in my throat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I have always been afraid of birds, something about the way they move, the way they swarm together, how unpredictable they are. And this was my worst nightmare come to life. I could feel my chest tightening, panic creeping in, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. My heart pounded hard, fast, my vision tunneling as I tried to focus, tried to tell myself it was just a flock of birds, nothing more. But it felt like more. It felt like they had come from nowhere, like they had been waiting for me. The birds moved in strange patterns, shifting as a unit, twisting and reforming in the air. They dipped down again, passing so low over my car that I thought they were going to hit it. I flinched, ducking instinctively, even though I was inside. I could hear their wings brushing against my windshield, their bodies cutting through the air just inches away. Then, as quickly as they had come, they moved on. The entire flock shifted, turned away from the road, and vanished into the fields beyond. The sky emptied, the air stilled, and just like that, it was over. I sat there, hands shaking, breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My entire body felt rigid, locked in place. My heart still hammered against my ribs, my skin cold with sweat. I stayed there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself to move. The silence felt unnatural after all that noise, after the rush of feathers and wind and chaos. My headlights still shone down the road, illuminating nothing but cracked pavement and open fields. Finally, I forced myself to move. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and eased my foot off the brake. The car rolled forward, the engine humming, everything else eerily quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the fields, refusing to check if the birds were still out there. I just wanted to get home. The rest of the drive was a blur. I barely remember pulling into my driveway, barely remember turning off the car, stepping out into the night air. All I knew was that my hands were still shaking when I reached for my front door, my legs unsteady as I stepped inside. I never drove that route at night again. I don't know why those birds were there, why they moved like that, why they seemed to come from nowhere. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a flock migrating, shifting direction, doing what birds do. But I've seen birds fly before, and I've never seen anything like that. Even now, years later, I still think about it. I still remember the sound of their wings, the feeling of sheer panic gripping my chest. And every time I see a large flock moving through the sky, I feel that same cold fear crawl up my spine, reminding me of that night on the empty road, when the birds came from nowhere, and for just a moment, it felt like they had come for me. I was driving back from a late meeting in Indiana, Pennsylvania, cutting through the back roads like I always did. It was the kind of rural stretch where you could drive for miles and not see another car, just rolling fields on both sides, a few scattered barns, and old wire fences marking off farmland. The only lights came from my headlights and the occasional flicker of a house far in the distance. The sky was starting to darken, though there was still a faint glow on the horizon. I wasn't in a rush, but I wasn't wasting time either. I just wanted to get home. The road ahead stretched long and empty, disappearing into the distance, the asphalt barely marked, cracked in places, worn from years of weather and disrepair. I could hear the steady hum of my tires against the pavement, the occasional bump of hitting a pothole or uneven patch of road. My mind wandered as I drove, thinking about the meeting, about what I had to do the next day, just the usual things that take up space in your head on long drives alone. Then, without warning, they appeared. A mass of black birds. Not crows, Something else, something slightly smaller, maybe starlings or grackles, but I couldn't be sure. They rose up from the fields like a dark wave, hundreds of them, maybe more. They moved together, a swirling cloud, a single entity made up of countless beating wings. I barely had time to react. I slammed on my brakes, the tires skidding on the worn road, and came to a stop just as the birds passed over me. They were so close I could hear them, the rush of wings, the chaotic rustling, the occasional sharp chirp cutting through the air. They weren't just flying overhead. They were circling, doubling back, their movement wild and unpredictable. My breath caught in my throat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I have always been afraid of birds, something about the way they move, the way they swarm together, how unpredictable they are. And this was my worst nightmare come to life. I could feel my chest tightening, panic creeping in, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. My heart pounded hard, fast, my vision tunneling as I tried to focus, tried to tell myself it was just a flock of birds, nothing more. But it felt like more. It felt like they had come from nowhere, like they had been waiting for me. The birds moved in strange patterns, shifting as a unit, twisting and reforming in the air. They dipped down again, passing so low over my car that I thought they were going to hit it. I flinched, ducking instinctively, even though I was inside. I could hear their wings brushing against my windshield, their bodies cutting through the air just inches away. Then, as quickly as they had come, they moved on. The entire flock shifted, turned away from the road, and vanished into the fields beyond. The sky emptied, the air stilled, and just like that, it was over. I sat there, hands shaking, breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My entire body felt rigid, locked in place. My heart still hammered against my ribs, my skin cold with sweat. I stayed there for a long moment, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself to move. The silence felt unnatural after all that noise, after the rush of feathers and wind and chaos. My headlights still shone down the road, illuminating nothing but cracked pavement and open fields. Finally, I forced myself to move. I took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and eased my foot off the brake. The car rolled forward, the engine humming, everything else eerily quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the fields, refusing to check if the birds were still out there. I just wanted to get home. The rest of the drive was a blur. I barely remember pulling into my driveway, barely remember turning off the car, stepping out into the night air. All I knew was that my hands were still shaking when I reached for my front door, my legs unsteady as I stepped inside. I never drove that route at night again. I don't know why those birds were there, why they moved like that, why they seemed to come from nowhere. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a flock migrating, shifting direction, doing what birds do. But I've seen birds fly before, and I've never seen anything like that. Even now, years later, I still think about it. I still remember the sound of their wings, the feeling of sheer panic gripping my chest. And every time I see a large flock moving through the sky, I feel that same cold fear crawl up my spine, reminding me of that night on the empty road, when the birds came from nowhere. And for just a moment, it felt like they had come for me. While backpacking deep in the mountains, at least 20 miles from any civilization, a friend and I stumbled upon something that left us shaken. The trip had been planned for months. We wanted to escape the noise of everyday life, push ourselves physically, and enjoy the kind of silence you can only find that deep in the wilderness. For the most part, that's exactly what we got. The first 2 days of hiking were grueling, but peaceful. The further we went, the more disconnected we felt from the world. The air was crisp, the trails narrow and winding, the only sounds coming from the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. We had seen no other hikers, no signs of recent human activity, just untouched wilderness stretching for miles in every direction. Then we found it. Tucked in a small clearing off the main trail was a crude structure, something that looked like a child's fort made of fallen logs and branches. At first, we thought it was just that, some old, forgotten shelter built by a passing group. But as we stepped closer, we saw details that turned our stomachs. Inside, nestled among the logs, were the remains of a fire. Not unusual by itself, but what caught our attention were the carvings on the walls. Dark, jagged scratches in the wood, crude figures drawn with some kind of sharp tool. The images were disturbing. Stick figures bound together, others standing around them. A person on a spit, drawn over flames like a pig being roasted. And then the words, "Girl meat is the best meat." A deep, primal fear settled in my gut. We weren't alone out here. Someone had made this. Someone had been here, thinking these thoughts, putting them into the world in a way that felt almost ritualistic. We didn't hesitate. We turned and left, moving fast, hearts pounding. Even when we reached the main trail, we didn't slow down. The entire hike back, we checked over our shoulders, scanning the trees, listening for footsteps that weren't our own. Even when we reached the road, even when we got in the car and started driving back to the city, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see something following us. I've never gone back to that area. I don't plan to. Some things you don't need answers to. Some places, once you've seen them, you know you're not meant to be there. I had always been drawn to the allure of remote destinations, places where nature's raw beauty remained unspoiled by the trappings of modern life. So when my friend invited me to visit Sorali, a secluded village nestled along Turkey's Mediterranean coast, I eagerly accepted. Known for its unspoiled beaches, lush green mountains, and a pace of life that encourages you to slow down, Sorali felt like a little slice of chilled-out Mediterranean heaven. The journey to Sorali was an adventure in itself. We navigated a long, winding, unpaved road that meandered through dense forests and rugged terrain. The further we traveled, the more civilization seemed to fade away, replaced by the serene whispers of nature. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm, golden hue over the landscape. The village exuded a tranquil charm, with its rustic cottages, narrow pathways, and the distant sound of waves caressing the shore. After settling in, my friend suggested we take advantage of the clear evening and head to the beach to witness the moonrise. Eager to experience the natural beauty of the place, I agreed. We made our way to the pebble-strewn beach, each step accompanied by the gentle crunch beneath our feet. The horizon stretched endlessly before us, the calm sea reflecting the dimming light of the sky. We found a comfortable spot and settled down, the cool evening breeze brushing against our skin. As we sat in companionable silence, the sky transitioned from shades of orange and pink to deeper blues and purples. The first stars began to twinkle overhead, and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. The moon began its ascent, emerging from the depths of the sea like a phantom. It started as a mere sliver, an orangey-red crescent that gradually expanded, casting a shimmering path of light across the water. The reflection wavered gently with the movement of the sea, creating a mesmerizing, almost hypnotic effect. As the moon climbed higher, it transformed from its ruddy hue to a brilliant white sphere, dominating the night sky. Its light was intense, almost unnaturally so, and it seemed to envelop everything in a cold, silvery sheen. The once comforting darkness was now replaced by an eerie luminescence that cast long, distorted shadows on the beach. I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. The moon appeared larger than I had ever seen, its presence overwhelming and oppressive. It felt as though it was watching us, an unblinking eye in the sky, and I couldn't escape its gaze. The reflection on the water only amplified this sensation, creating a disorienting mirror image that seemed to pull at the edges of my sanity. My heart rate quickened, and a cold sweat formed on my brow. I tried to focus on the rhythmic sound of the waves, hoping to ground myself, but the dread continued to build. It was an irrational fear, one that I couldn't explain, but it gripped me with an intensity one had never experienced before. Unable to bear it any longer, I turned to my friend and muttered an excuse about feeling unwell. Concern flashed across their face, but they didn't question me. We gathered our things and made our way back to the village, the oppressive light of the moon casting long shadows behind us. Back in the safety of our lodging, I closed the shutters tightly, desperate to shut out the moon's piercing gaze. Even then, I could feel its presence, a lingering weight pressing down on me. Sleep was elusive that night, my mind replaying the unsettling experience over and over. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night on the beach. The beauty of Sorali remained, but it was now tinged with a sense of foreboding. I found myself avoiding the beach after sunset, unwilling to face the moon's haunting presence again. Reflecting on the experience, I realized that nature, in all its splendor, holds the power to evoke profound emotions within us. The same scene that might inspire awe in one person can instill deep-seated fear in another. It's a reminder of our vulnerability and the mysteries that the natural world still holds, even in places of serene beauty like Sorali. The road stretched out in front of me like an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt, cutting through the barren, sun-baked landscape. The desert surrounded me on all sides, vast and empty, nothing but low shrubs and dust devils twisting in the distance. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway and the relentless heat pressing down on me, making my eyelids feel heavy. The gas gauge was dipping lower than I liked, and I needed a break, both to stretch my legs and to shake off the growing fatigue that came with the open road. According to the map, the nearest place to stop was a small town about 100 miles north of Reno. Calling it a town was generous. It was barely a blip on the map, a name with no real description, the kind of place that existed only because the road ran through it. I figured I'd grab some food, use the bathroom, maybe fill up the tank if there was even a gas station to be found. When I reached the turnoff, I saw the place in the distance, a handful of buildings surrounded by an expanse of nothingness. A single road led into the so-called town, flanked by dry, cracked earth and a scattering of rusted-out vehicles that looked like they hadn't moved in decades. I passed a faded sign that once bore the town's name, but time and the elements had worn away most of the letters. Now it was just a ghostly, half-legible reminder that people lived here, though I couldn't imagine why. The heart of the town, if you could call it that, consisted of two main buildings, a casino/motel and another casino that had been converted from what looked like an old house. There was a small general store with sun-bleached siding and a sagging roof, and beyond that, a collection of rundown trailers, probably the homes of the people who worked at these places. Nothing else. No post office, no school, no signs of normal life. Just this isolated cluster of structures in the middle of nowhere, baking under the brutal Nevada sun. I pulled into the parking lot of the casino/motel. The lot was mostly empty, save for a few dusty cars and a couple of pickup trucks that looked like they belonged to locals. The place itself was an aging, squat building, its paint peeling and its neon sign buzzing weakly in the daylight. It advertised loose slots, cheap rooms, in faded red letters. As I stepped out of my car, the heat hit me like a wall. The air was thick with the smell of hot pavement and something else, something stale and faintly metallic, like old blood or rust. The thought unsettled me, but I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. Inside, the air was marginally cooler, but carried the heavy scent of stale cigarette smoke and something deeper. Something I could only describe as despair. The lighting was dim, a mix of flickering fluorescence and the garish glow of the slot machines. A tired-looking bar sat in one corner, its counter covered in sticky rings from long-forgotten drinks. A few tables were scattered around, but they were all empty. In the far corner of the room, there were 3 slot machines, each occupied by a person who looked as though they had been sitting there forever. They were large, their bodies spilling over the edges of the cheap plastic stools, their clothes stained and stretched tight over their forms. Their skin was pale and unhealthy, the kind of pallor that comes from spending too much time indoors under artificial light. Their eyes, God, their eyes, were empty, devoid of anything resembling life. They didn't even look up when I walked in. Their fingers moved mechanically, pressing buttons in a hypnotic rhythm, their gazes locked onto the flashing screens in front of them. The machines chirped and beeped, but there was no joy in their faces, no reaction at all. It was like they weren't even there, just empty husks going through the motions. A slow dread settled in my stomach. I had seen lonely places before, but this was something else. This was a place where time had stopped, where people came and never left, where they faded into the background until they became part of the furniture. It was as though they had been swallowed by the desert itself, their lives reduced to nothing more than the endless cycle of the machines. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I had no reason to be afraid. There was nothing overtly threatening about this place, no immediate danger. But every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. I turned on my heel and walked straight back out the door. The heat outside was suffocating, but I welcomed it. At least it was real. The moment I was back in my car, I locked the doors and started the engine. I didn't even bother looking for gas. I just needed to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. As I sped back onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The town shrank behind me, fading into the heat haze, disappearing into the endless stretch of desert. I didn't stop driving for hours. I didn't even turn on the radio. The silence of the road was preferable to the memory of that place, to the empty eyes of those people who had been swallowed whole by something I couldn't name. I never found out what that town was called. I never looked it up. Some places are better left forgotten. Driving down a back road on the outskirts of town, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the cracked asphalt. The road was old, barely maintained, lined with faded wooden fence posts that leaned with age. Dry grass and weeds pushed through the cracks in the pavement, and the whole stretch felt forgotten. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where houses were few and far between, and the ones that were still standing had long since lost their original color, paint peeling, shutters hanging askew. My friend was in the market for a used car, and this area had a scattering of small, independent lots that specialized in older vehicles. Most were little more than oversized yards with mismatched, sun-bleached cars lined up haphazardly, some missing tires, others with shattered windows. It was the kind of place you'd find a cheap vehicle if you were willing to overlook a few rust spots and a questionable history. We had already passed 2 lots that looked promising but had kept driving, hoping for something better. Then we spotted it. An old building with a sun-bleached sign, its letters barely legible, advertising used cars and parts. It sat behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, the gate slightly open. Rows of old vehicles stretched behind it, a mix of trucks, sedans, and a few motorcycles, all coated in a layer of dust. But what caught my friend's attention was an old Datsun, sitting further back, partially hidden behind the fence. It was a deep shade of blue, faded by years in the sun, its headlights clouded, but it looked intact. The windshield had writing on it in thick white marker, probably a price or mileage, but a silver sunshade reflected the sunlight, making it impossible to read. We pulled off onto the gravel shoulder, parking just outside the fence. There was no sign of an attendant or owner, and the building looked closed, dark windows, door shut tight. My friend wanted a better look at the car, and I wasn't about to sit in the car alone, so we both got out. The fence ran along the property, separating the lot from a narrow embankment that sloped down toward the road. The ground was dry, loose dirt mixed with patches of dead grass. We stepped carefully, trying not to slide, making our way down to a spot where we could see through the fence better. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked metal, the faint scent of oil and rust drifting from the lot. My friend took out her phone to snap a picture, angling it to avoid the glare from the sunshade. That's when I noticed it. Something stuck in the dirt, half buried, just off the side of the road. At first, it looked like dried grass or a piece of rope, tangled in the weeds. But as I moved closer, the color stood out, a pale blonde, too smooth, too uniform to be grass or string. My stomach tightened as my mind registered what I was looking at. A ponytail. Thick, blonde, slightly wavy, the strands clumped together with dirt. It was partially buried, the exposed hair fanned out over the ground, the end of it disappearing beneath the dry soil. It didn't look like it had been cut. It looked torn, as if it had been yanked out violently. I took a slow step back, my breath suddenly feeling too loud in the quiet air. My friend, still focused on the car, hadn't noticed. My skin crawled, a deep unease settling in my chest. There was no reason for something like this to be here. Hair doesn't just show up on the side of a forgotten road, tangled in the dirt like a discarded thing. My mind went through the possibilities, but none of them felt right. Maybe it was from a wig, but why would a wig be buried in the ground? Maybe it was an animal, some kind of fur? But no, I could see the individual strands, the slight sheen of human hair catching the sunlight. I looked around. The road was empty, stretching in both directions, disappearing over a hill in the distance. The nearest house was too far away to be seen, and the lot behind us was silent. No movement, no sign of anyone watching. I should have left it alone. I should have turned around, gotten back in the car, and driven away. But something about it unsettled me so deeply that I had to be sure. I bent down, hesitating, then reached out and lightly touched the edge of the hair. The dirt shifted beneath it, loosening, and that's when I saw it. A piece of scalp, still attached. It was small, dried out, the color of old leather. The edges were jagged, torn unevenly, as if something had ripped it away rather than cut it clean. My breath caught in my throat. The world around me suddenly felt too still, the air too thick. The logical part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was from a medical cadaver, a discarded piece from some morbid experiment. Maybe it had been here for years, forgotten. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. My legs felt weak as I stood up, heart pounding against my ribs. I turned to my friend, who was still oblivious, still taking pictures of the car. I wanted to call her over, show her, ask her what she thought, but some instinct, something primal, told me not to. I took one last look at the thing in the dirt, then forced myself to turn away. My movements felt slow, deliberate, like I was wading through something thick and invisible. I reached out, touched my friend's arm lightly. She glanced at me, confused. "Let's go," I said, voice tight. She frowned but didn't question it. We climbed back up the embankment, brushing dust from our hands, the air suddenly feeling heavier. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on us as we got into the car. The engine roared to life, breaking the eerie stillness, and as we pulled away, I forced myself not to look back. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I scoured local news, looking for any missing persons reports, any mention of a body found near that road. Nothing. No reports, no investigations, nothing at all. But that didn't make it any less real. That blonde ponytail, half buried in the dirt, would stay with me forever. And no matter how much time passed, I would never go back to that road again. I used to throw a paper route in the Gladstone, Smithville, and Holt, Missouri areas. 6 years ago, that was my routine, 5 hours every night, driving nearly 200 miles and tossing around 700 newspapers. Some people only got a paper on Sundays, others on Mondays, and a handful every single day. It was an endless cycle of driving, rolling papers, throwing them, and repeating until sunrise. It was a hot June night, the air thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier. I had been driving through the countryside, hitting up isolated farmhouses, long gravel roads, and dark patches of nowhere that made me feel like I was the only person left in the world. If you've ever been out there at night, you'd understand the vast emptiness, the way the land swallows you up, the distant flickers of farmhouse lights barely breaking the darkness. There's something about the middle of nowhere that makes you feel like an intruder, even when you belong there. I was nearing the last leg of my route, somewhere outside Holt, Missouri. One of those isolated farms, the kind with a metal cattle gate at the entrance and a gravel driveway stretching into the shadows beyond. The only sign of life was the dim glow of the farmhouse porch light, casting long shadows over the yard. The farmer who lived here was one of those people who took their newspaper very seriously. If it wasn't placed just right, I'd hear about it the next day through my supervisor. I needed every dollar I made, so I always tried to make sure I got it right. I slowed to a stop at the gate, rolled down my window, and grabbed the neatly wrapped newspaper from the passenger seat. I gave it a solid throw, putting all my arm into it. But right as it left my hand, I heard the unmistakable snap of the rubber band breaking. The paper exploded in midair, its pages fluttering like a wounded bird, landing far from where it should have been, somewhere deep in the farmer's yard. Cursing under my breath, I knew I had no choice. If I left it like that, I'd lose money, and more importantly, I'd have to deal with the farmer's complaints. I parked, hopped out, and climbed over the metal gate. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way toward the paper, heart beating a little faster than usual. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had done this job long enough to get used to it. But there was something unsettling about being in someone else's yard in the dead of night. I found the paper a few yards from the driveway, gathered the scattered pages, and quickly reassembled it as best I could. I placed it carefully on the gravel, making sure it was neat and presentable. Then I turned back toward my car. That's when I saw it. Something was inside my car. For a second, my mind refused to process it. I had left the driver's side door open, and there was something, sitting in my seat. It was gripping the steering wheel with pale, bony hands. My breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought maybe I had imagined it, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But then it moved. Its head jerked violently, snapping up to face me. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its skin was too pale, almost sickly white, and its face was expressionless until its mouth opened. It wasn't a normal mouth. It was a gaping black void, toothless and impossibly wide. And then it screamed. The sound that came out of it was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't human. It was an animalistic, high-pitched wail, like metal scraping against metal, like something being torn apart. My legs felt frozen to the ground. My chest tightened, and my ears rang from the sheer intensity of the noise. Before I could react, it lunged. But not at me. It shot out of the car, moving unnaturally fast, twisting its body through the open passenger side window in a way no person could. In 2 giant leaps, it was halfway across the yard. Pure instinct took over. My hand shot to my hip, and I pulled my .44 from its holster. I aimed and fired, the gunshot splitting the night like a lightning strike. The bullet hit it dead center in the back, right along the spine. It should have gone down. It didn't. The thing stopped, turned its head slightly, and looked at me. Its hollow mouth was still wide open, but there was no scream this time. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes your bones ache. I fired again, my hands shaking, my heart hammering. This time, the bullet grazed its shoulder. A dark, wet stain spread across its pale skin, but it didn't react like a normal person would. No cry of pain, no staggering. Just a slow, deliberate step toward me. That was all I needed to see. I turned and ran. I vaulted over the cattle gate, so fast I barely felt the metal under my hands. I didn't stop running until I was back in the driver's seat, slamming the door shut, locking it, and peeling out of that driveway like my life depended on it. Because in that moment, it did. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep the wheel steady. My mind was screaming at me, trying to process what had just happened. I kept glancing at my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing chasing me down the road. But there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of highway, the fields on either side, and the distant glow of farmhouses. I didn't finish my route that night. I didn't even call in to explain why. I just drove straight home, locked every door in my apartment, and sat on my couch with my gun still in my lap, waiting for the sun to come up. I never went back. The next day, I quit my job at the newspaper. I didn't give them a reason. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just knew I couldn't go back out there. Not after what I had seen. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing sitting in my car. That pale skin, that gaping mouth, that scream. It followed me into my dreams, into my waking thoughts. I tried to convince myself that it hadn't been real, that I had imagined it, but I knew better. 6 years later, I still think about that night. I've tried to move on, tried to bury it in the past. I took a job at a meat processing plant in southern Kansas City. Something normal, something that kept me surrounded by people. But no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night is still out there. Somewhere. And every now and then, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch myself glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see it sitting in my back seat, hands on the wheel, waiting for me to notice. The woods behind my cousin's house weren't anything special at first glance. Just old trees, thick underbrush, and a narrow dirt path winding through. We spent a lot of time back there when we were younger, exploring and pretending we were in some kind of adventure movie. But what made it stand out was the sewer storm drain network that ran through it. A twisted labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and chambers built to drain rainwater from the surrounding area. Some of them were massive, big enough to walk through. Others were tight, barely wide enough to crawl into. We didn't know how far they went, only that they stretched for miles, disappearing beneath the earth like some forgotten maze. It was late summer, the air thick and humid, the kind of heat that made everything smell damp. I remember my shirt sticking to my back as we walked through the woods, the familiar buzzing of cicadas overhead. My cousins had been through the drains before, but for me, this was my first time going that deep. I'd heard their stories, how the tunnels twisted and turned, how some areas had collapsed, leaving jagged piles of broken concrete and rebar sticking out like bones. They told me about the dining room, an old chamber deep inside, but they never really explained why they called it that. Getting inside wasn't hard. The main entrance was a sloped concrete tunnel, wide enough to walk into without bending down. It stank of rot and stagnant water, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. We stepped carefully, our footsteps echoing. The deeper we went, the darker it got, the heat of the outside world fading into a cold, damp chill. Water dripped from the ceiling, and every now and then, a rat would scurry past, disappearing into the dark. After what felt like forever, we reached the dining room. It wasn't actually a room, just a wide-open chamber where several tunnels met. The walls were coated in slime, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Water pooled on the ground, about 3 feet deep in the center, the surface broken by floating debris. Old branches, bits of trash, unidentifiable lumps of something that had probably been dead for a while. We stuck to the sides, moving along the narrow ledges that ran along the walls. The ground was slick, every step uncertain. I kept my eyes on my footing, making sure I didn't slip. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a few small bones in the water. Ribs, long and thin, barely visible beneath the murky surface. I stopped, staring down, my brain trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then I saw the leg bone, half buried in the sludge at the bottom. My stomach tightened. My cousins were already freaking out, whispering about getting the hell out of there. But I didn't move. I kept staring, my eyes scanning the water, searching for more. And I found them. More bones. A lot more. Scattered beneath the surface, piled in some places, like they had been dumped here. Some were small, but others were unmistakably human. Long femurs, pieces of what had to be pelvises, broken fragments of skulls. For a moment, my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just animal bones. Maybe some hunter had dumped them here. But then I spotted something that made my breath catch in my throat, a set of teeth, still attached to part of a jawbone. I knew my bones. These weren't from a deer. These weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. My cousins were already moving back, their nerves shot. I could feel their fear, their urgency, but I wasn't ready to go just yet. I crouched down, reaching out slowly, feeling the cold, slimy water against my fingertips. That's when I spotted the skull. It was partially buried in the sludge, the empty sockets staring up at me. But as I lifted it, I saw the telltale shape of antlers, the familiar elongated snout. A deer skull. My heart pounded in my chest. Maybe, the other bones weren't human after all. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But even now, years later, I still don't believe that. We never reported it. Never told anyone what we saw. It felt like stepping into something we weren't supposed to see, something meant to stay buried. We left that night without looking back, and I never went back inside those tunnels again. But sometimes I think about it, about the way those bones looked in the water, about how they were all broken, scattered like something, or someone, had left them there. And I wonder, what if they weren't just dumped? What if something had put them there? We packed up my car with everything we thought we'd need for the night. Tents, sleeping bags, snacks, and a cooler full of drinks. The plan was simple: head out to the middle of nowhere, away from city lights, and watch the meteor shower that was supposed to peak tonight. I had driven these backroads before, but never this far out. I figured the more remote we got, the better the view would be. No distractions, no other people, just us and the night sky. The roads became more narrow as we went deeper into the countryside. The last gas station we saw had been miles back, and soon, the pavement turned into dirt and gravel. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and fields stretching endlessly on either side. Occasionally, an old barn or a house would appear, but they were few and far between. Some looked abandoned, others just dark and quiet. No streetlights, no signs, just the road ahead and the night around us. It wasn't long before we found the perfect spot, a wide open field, far enough from any roads that no passing cars would ruin our night. I slowed the car and turned off onto the grass, the tires crunching softly as we rolled in. The fog had started creeping in, low and thick. It clung to the ground, swirling as the car disturbed it. I cut the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy, only broken by the sound of our doors opening and closing. The air was cool, damp with moisture from the fog. The sky above was clear, but the ground-level mist was thickening. It made everything feel isolated, like the rest of the world didn't exist beyond the edges of the field. We set up quickly, laying out blankets and getting comfortable. The meteor shower hadn't started yet, but the stars were bright, scattered across the sky in a way you never saw in the city. It felt like we were the only people left on Earth. Then we noticed it, the red phone box. It stood just beyond the edge of the field, barely visible through the fog. The light inside glowed dimly, casting a faint red hue around it. It looked old, weathered, something out of place in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings nearby, no power lines, nothing that explained why it was there or why it was lit up. It made no sense. We hadn't seen it when we drove in, but now it was impossible to miss. The fog made the glow eerie, distorting its shape slightly as it wavered in the mist. It was the kind of thing that made your stomach sink, an unease that you couldn't quite justify, but felt all the same. The longer we stared at it, the more unsettling it became. The light flickered slightly, but the box itself didn't move. It was just there, a relic in the middle of an empty landscape. We tried to ignore it. We focused on the sky, waiting for the first meteors to streak across the blackness, but my eyes kept drifting back to that red glow in the distance. It felt like it was watching us, though I knew that was ridiculous. It was just a phone box, nothing more. Then, one of us pointed out something else. Across the road, up on a hill, just barely visible through the fog, was a shape. It was hard to make out at first, but as our eyes adjusted, the details became clear: a statue, sitting in a chair. It was massive, looming in the darkness. The kind of statue you'd expect in a city square, not hidden away in the woods. The figure was seated, its posture unnatural, like it was watching something in the distance. The fog made it look like it was shifting, but it wasn't. It was just still. Too still. Between the phone box and the statue, something about this place was wrong. The air felt heavier, like we weren't supposed to be here. Then the fog thickened. It rolled in fast, swallowing the field, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of us. The car was barely visible now, just a dark outline in the mist. The phone box, once a distant glow, became a barely there smudge of red. The statue on the hill disappeared completely. The temperature dropped. The dampness soaked through my clothes, and my skin prickled. Something in me screamed to leave. The fog felt wrong, not just weather, but something heavier. It silenced everything, absorbing sound, making the world feel empty. I didn't hear a single bug, no wind through the trees, nothing. Just the dull ringing in my ears from the sheer, suffocating quiet. We grabbed our things in a hurry. The excitement of the night was gone. No one spoke. We all felt it, that deep instinct telling us to go. I started the car, the headlights barely cutting through the fog as I turned us back toward the road. As we pulled away, the red glow of the phone box faded into the mist. I didn't look back. The drive back was silent. No one wanted to talk about it, but we all felt it. That wrongness, that unnatural emptiness in the air. When we finally reached the main roads, where streetlights flickered and houses stood with warm, familiar lights, the tension in my chest finally eased. We never spoke about that night again. Never went back. But sometimes late at night, I wonder, who used that phone box? Why was that statue there? And what would have happened if we had stayed just a little longer? The plan was simple: drive through the night, make it to Oregon by early morning, and have a full day with family for Thanksgiving. My fiancée and I had done road trips before, but this was different. We were leaving straight from work, running on fumes, and heading into long stretches of highway with barely any civilization. The drive was going to be tough, but we figured we could switch off if we got too tired. The first few hours were uneventful. The usual city traffic gave way to quieter highways, and soon, we were deep into the vast stretches of I-5, where exits became rare and the road felt endless. We talked for a while, played some music, and settled into the rhythm of the drive. As the hours stretched on, the excitement wore off, replaced by the quiet hum of the tires on pavement and the dim glow of the dashboard. The road was dark, only occasionally lit by the headlights of a passing semi. Towns were few and far between, and for long stretches, it felt like we were the only car on the highway. By the time we reached Wairika, it was around 1:30 a.m. The temperature had dropped significantly, hovering around 35 or 40 degrees. The road stretched ahead in a long, empty ribbon, flanked by dark trees and rolling hills. My fiancée had dozed off in the passenger seat, wrapped in a blanket. I was exhausted, but the kind of exhaustion that comes with hours of driving, where the road lulls you into a strange, almost hypnotic state. I kept my eyes on the lines, willing myself to stay alert. Then I saw something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shape on the side of the road, barely illuminated by my headlights. As I got closer, the details sharpened. A person walking along the shoulder of the interstate. They were dressed in all black. Long trench coat, heavy boots. No backpack, no visible belongings. Just walking, head down, at a slow but steady pace. I felt an immediate chill run down my spine. This stretch of I-5 was isolated. No exits for miles, no broken down cars, no houses or businesses. Just empty road and forest. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour, in near-freezing temperatures, with no visible transportation. As I passed, I tried to get a better look. Their face was turned away, hidden by the hood of the coat. They didn't react to my headlights, didn't turn to look, just kept walking, slow and deliberate. I felt my pulse quicken. Something about this was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the strangeness of seeing someone there. It was the way my body reacted. That gut feeling, primal and immediate, screaming at me that this wasn't right. My fiancée stirred in her sleep, mumbling something unintelligible, and I snapped my eyes back to the road. My fingers tightened on the wheel. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if they had turned around, if they had stopped walking, if they were watching us. I pressed my foot down on the gas, increasing speed. The road stretched on, endless and dark. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there had to be some explanation. A hitchhiker, a stranded driver, someone who lived nearby. But the feeling in my chest didn't go away. Minutes passed. Then miles. No sign of another car, no sign of a vehicle broken down on the side of the road. Just the empty interstate and the feeling that something was still off. I fought the urge to look in the mirror, to check if they were still back there. I told myself I didn't need to, that it didn't matter. And then, up ahead, just beyond the reach of my headlights, I saw movement. A figure. Another person. Or the same one. Walking along the shoulder, dressed in black. Same coat, same slow, steady pace. My chest tightened. My hands felt ice cold on the steering wheel. It wasn't possible. We had been driving at high speed, non-stop. There was no way someone on foot could have gotten ahead of us. No side roads, no exits, no cars. Just the empty stretch of I-5. I swallowed hard. My fiancée was still asleep. I didn't wake her. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, faster now, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to get as far away from that figure as possible. I don't know how long it was before the feeling started to fade, before the road started to feel normal again. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe an hour. But eventually, the tension in my chest loosened. The air in the car didn't feel as thick. The night stretched on, uneventful, the way it should have been. By the time we crossed into Oregon, I was exhausted in a way I had never been before. My muscles ached from how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. My eyes felt dry, my head heavy. My fiancée woke up, stretching, asking where we were. I told her we were almost there. I didn't mention what I had seen. I didn't want to say it out loud. When we finally pulled into the driveway of her parents' house, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting out a slow breath. The warmth of the house, the glow of the porch light, the smell of Thanksgiving cooking, it all felt surreal, like I had just stepped back into the real world from somewhere else. Somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I never told anyone about that night. Never tried to explain it, because I don't think there is an explanation. Just a memory, burned into my mind, the dark road, the freezing air, and the figure in black, walking where no one should have been. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, just open desert stretching for miles in every direction. The sky was clear, the sun high, making everything around me shimmer in the heat. I had been on the road for hours, my gas tank just under half full, and my stomach growling. I hadn't seen a town in at least an hour, maybe more. The last sign I remembered reading said something about a rest stop ahead, so I kept going, hoping I'd find a place to eat, stretch my legs, and maybe refill my tank just in case. The road was cracked, faded, like it hadn't been repainted in years. Every once in a while, I'd see an old road sign, barely standing, rusted from years of wind and sun. My phone had lost signal a long time ago, and the only sound in my car was the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio, trying to find a station. I kept my eyes on the road, scanning for any signs of life. Nothing. Just more desert, more dirt, more sun. Then I saw it. A small building up ahead, set back a little from the road. A gas station, or at least what used to be one. The old sign out front was faded, the windows dark, but the pumps were still standing. There was no other traffic on the road, no cars in the lot. It looked abandoned, but I figured I could at least check to see if there was anything useful inside. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching over loose gravel. The silence was heavy, pressing down on everything. There was no wind, no birds, just the faint creak of the old gas station sign swaying slightly in the heat. I got out, the hot air hitting me like a wall. The pavement beneath my shoes felt like it had been baking for hours, which it probably had. The front door of the station was slightly open, just a crack. I hesitated, then pushed it open all the way. Inside, the air was thick, stale. The shelves were mostly empty, but there were still a few things left. Dusty cans of food, a couple of bottled waters, a row of old motor oil bottles lined up near the counter. There was a thick layer of dust on everything, like no one had been in here for a long time. I walked farther inside, stepping carefully. The counter had an old register, the kind with buttons instead of a touchscreen. A door behind it led to a back room, maybe an office or storage area. I looked around some more, grabbed a bottle of water, and was about to leave when I noticed something strange. Near the back of the store, a set of footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here recently. Maybe still was. I listened, standing completely still, holding my breath. Nothing. The building was silent. I walked toward the back room door, careful with every step. The footprints led right to it. I put my hand on the knob, hesitated, then turned it. The door swung open. The room was small, mostly empty except for a few old crates, a broken chair, and a cot in the corner. A blanket was crumpled on top of it. Someone had been sleeping here. Recently. The air had a faint smell, sweat, something sour, something metallic. I looked around, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I heard it. A sound from outside. A soft crunch of gravel. Someone was out there. I stepped back, moving toward the front of the store. My car was still where I left it, but now behind it, I saw something else. Footprints leading away from the car, disappearing around the side of the building. Someone had walked right past it while I was inside. I moved quickly now, stepping outside, scanning my surroundings. Nothing, but I could feel it. Someone was watching. The silence was too deep, too unnatural. I reached for my car door, ready to get inside and leave, when I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow moving behind the building. I got in, slammed the door, locked it. My hands were shaking as I reached for the keys. The engine turned over, but as soon as it did, something slammed against the back of the car. I whipped around. Nothing. Just the empty lot. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it. I slammed the car into reverse, backing up fast, then threw it into drive and peeled out of the lot. My heart was pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. In the rearview mirror, the gas station got smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. I kept driving, not looking back, pushing the speed limit. After what felt like forever, I saw another sign. A real town was up ahead. When I finally pulled into the first gas station I saw, I got out, my legs feeling weak. I filled up my tank, went inside, and grabbed a drink. The cashier looked at me strangely, maybe because I looked pale, shaken. I wanted to ask if they knew anything about that abandoned station, but I didn't. I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to get home. As I drove away, I kept thinking about those fresh footprints, about the feeling of being watched, about the way something slammed into my car. I'll never know who was out there, or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone in that gas station. I didn't think I'd end up lost. Nobody ever does. The plan was simple: hike out to a remote lake I'd read about, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. I packed light, brought a map, a compass, some extra food, and plenty of water. I checked the forecast. Clear skies, mild temperatures, nothing to worry about. I'd done solo hikes before, and I wasn't going far. Just a quiet night in the woods, away from everything. The trail started easy, a narrow dirt path winding through tall pines. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on fallen needles and the occasional bird overhead. The further I went, the more the trail faded. Less defined, less traveled. That was expected. Not many people came this way. That's what I wanted. I kept checking my map, making sure I was on course. According to it, the lake wasn't far. Maybe another mile or so. The terrain got rougher, steeper inclines, dense undergrowth. At some point, I stepped over a fallen log, and when I looked back, the trail behind me was gone. Just trees. I wasn't worried. I had my bearings. I kept moving forward, trusting I'd find the lake soon. But I didn't. After another hour of hiking, the ground started sloping downward, steeper than I expected. My legs were getting tired, my pack heavier. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows. I should have reached the lake by now. I checked my map again, but nothing looked right. The terrain didn't match. I tried my compass. The needle spun sluggishly before settling. I was still heading west. That should have put me at the lake. But there was no lake. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe I miscalculated the distance. Maybe the lake was just beyond the next rise. I pressed on. The trees thickened, branches clawing at my clothes. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots and rocks. I started to sweat despite the cool air. I took out my water bottle, drank half of it, and kept moving. Then I stepped into a clearing, and my stomach dropped. I had been here before. The same fallen log, the same slanted tree leaning awkwardly to the right. I had walked in a circle. That's when the first sliver of fear crept in. I took a deep breath, forced myself to think. I had a map, a compass. I could backtrack, find my way back to the main trail. I wasn't that far out. I turned around, retraced my steps. But the woods all looked the same. Every tree, every shadow, identical. I moved faster, heart pounding. The sun had dropped lower, the sky shifting to a dull orange. I checked my watch. I had about an hour before dark. I needed to find shelter. I picked a spot near a thick cluster of trees, out of the wind. I gathered branches, built a small fire. The flames flickered weakly, barely illuminating the surrounding woods. The fire gave me something to focus on. I ate a protein bar, sipped my water. I had enough supplies to last the night, but I needed to find my way out at first light. The forest was different at night. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. Every small sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, sent a jolt through me. I knew there were animals out here. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. But it wasn't the animals that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress. My mind playing tricks. But the feeling didn't go away. At some point, I dozed off. When I woke up, the fire was just embers. The woods were dead silent. Not even the wind. That's what scared me the most. The absolute silence. I forced myself to stay put until dawn. When the first sliver of light broke through the trees, I packed up and started moving. My legs were stiff, my throat dry. I needed to find my way back before my water ran out. I picked a direction and stuck to it, forcing myself to keep going. Hours passed. Nothing looked familiar. Panic threatened to take over, but I shoved it down. I focused on survival. I followed a small creek, hoping it would lead to a larger water source, maybe even a road. But the creek twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the woods. My legs ached, my feet throbbed. I stopped to rest, rationed my last bit of water. Then I saw something through the trees. A structure. Small, wooden, weathered. A hunting cabin, maybe. Relief flooded through me. I stumbled toward it, hands shaking. If there was a cabin, there had to be a way out nearby. The door was slightly open. Inside, dust covered everything. An old chair, a rusted stove, a pile of firewood in the corner. No sign of anyone. But there were empty cans, an old blanket, a knife on the table. Someone had been here before. I searched for a map, a radio, anything. Nothing useful. But there was a trail leading away from the cabin. Faint, overgrown, but a trail. I followed it. I walked for hours, every step fueled by desperation. My legs burned, my lips cracked from thirst. Then, finally, I heard something. Distant, faint. A car engine. I pushed forward, breaking through the trees, stumbling onto a dirt road. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost collapsed. The road meant people. Civilization. I wasn't going to die out here. Eventually, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. He was a local hunter. He gave me water, let me sit in the cab while he radioed for help. When I finally made it back to town, I looked at a map. The lake I had been searching for was miles from where I had ended up. I had gone completely off course, deeper into the wilderness than I ever intended. I don't know how I got so lost. I don't know how I found that cabin. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again.